All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going deep into one of the most raw, personal, and frankly complicated documents from the ancient world, St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. You see, hidden inside this letter is this amazing web of tiny details. And when you start comparing them to the historical account in the Acts of the Apostles, something incredible about its authenticity just snaps into focus.
Our whole investigation kicks off with this gut punch of a confession. I mean, listen to that language. Paul isn't just having a bad day here. He's saying he was so utterly crushed, so far beyond his own strength, that he was absolutely convinced he was about to die. This right here is our first clue, a real fragment of intense human suffering from almost 2,000 years ago.
So first up, we're going to try to connect Paul's intense emotional state with the historical record we have in Acts. And what you're about to see is how two totally different accounts, one all about feeling, one all about facts, lock together like they were made for each other.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Look at how these two texts basically solve each other's mysteries. On the left, in 2 Corinthians, we get Paul's inner world, this feeling of absolute, life-ending despair. But there are almost no details about why. Then, on the right, you've got Acts 19, which describes this massive, citywide riot in Ephesus. A mob grabs Paul's friends, and things are so out of control that everyone is begging Paul not to go into the public theater for his own safety.
You see what's happening? The letter gives us the feeling, but not the facts. The history gives us the facts, but not the feeling. Now think about it. If someone were faking this, trying to write a letter that seemed real, they would have almost certainly borrowed the dramatic details from Acts to make their story more believable. But that's not what happens. They don't overlap, they perfectly complement each other. It's exactly what you would expect from two separate, honest accounts of the same terrifying event.
All right, let's move on to our next puzzle. This one is a little different. It starts not with despair, but with this really mysterious command to forgive someone, and it just sort of pops up out of nowhere in 2 Corinthians.
So Paul is telling the church in Corinth to forgive and welcome back some unnamed man who has apparently been punished. But who is this guy? What did he do? What was the punishment? The letter doesn't say. It's written with this casual assumption that the readers know exactly what he's talking about. And the key to this whole puzzle, it turns out, is in his first letter to Corinth. In that earlier letter, he gave this incredibly harsh command to kick a man out of the church for being involved in a shocking public scandal. So this vague instruction to forgive in the second letter, it's the obvious follow-up, the sequel to that very specific judgment in the first.
And this is the point, right? It doesn't feel manufactured. A forger would have spelled it out for you. They would have said something like, hey, remember that guy I told you to punish? Well, let's talk about him now, to show how clever they were. The fact that the reference is so casual, so off the cuff, strongly suggests this is a real situation unfolding in real time with a real community that didn't need any reminders about what happened.
Okay, next up, let's look at a puzzle that's all about timing and motivation, and it's hidden in something as boring as a travel itinerary. It seems Paul was being accused of being flaky, of promising to visit and then not showing up.
But Paul's defense is kinda weird. He says he changed his plans to spare them. To spare them from what? Why on earth would his visit cause them pain? This statement really only makes sense if there's some bigger context we're not seeing in this letter alone.
And here is how all the pieces fit together. In 2 Corinthians, Paul finally explains why he changed his mind. He wanted to avoid a really painful confrontation. He needed to give that first very harsh letter time to do its work before he showed up in person. And amazingly, if you dig into the travel clues in both Acts and 1 Corinthians, they confirm this new updated itinerary. It's this super complex web of motivation and logistics that, honestly, no forger would bother to construct so subtly.
Now this next one, this example might be the most powerful of them all. This is a case where the history book, Acts, and the personal letter from Paul seem to be heading for a head-on collision. They walk right up to the very edge of a contradiction, but they never fall off.
So in 2 Corinthians, Paul lays out this incredible list of all the things he suffered, but when you check the history book, Acts, up to the point this letter was written, well, the numbers don't seem to add up. Paul says he was beaten with rods 3 times. Acts only tells us about one of those times. He says he was shipwrecked 3 times. Acts hasn't mentioned a single one yet. So what gives? Is Paul exaggerating?
Let's just zoom in on the stoning for a second. In his letter, Paul makes a simple claim, once was I stoned. Okay, now look at the book of Acts. It records exactly one time that he was stoned, in a city called Lystra, but check out the incredibly subtle wording. Acts doesn't say Paul was dead.
It says the crowd dragged him away, supposing he was dead. Paul's simple statement in his letter, "Once was I stoned," doesn't just confirm the event happened, it confirms he survived it. The two accounts are in perfect harmony, but they get there from completely different directions.
This is what the 18th century philosopher William Paley was talking about when he said, "This is the hallmark of truth." For two independent stories to line up so perfectly on such a tiny, delicate point, without one just copying the other, is almost impossible. Unless they're both tied to a real event. It's just too subtle to be a forgery and way too lucky to be an accident.
Okay, for our last piece of the puzzle, let's look at one final, remarkably subtle clue. This one's geographic, and it's hidden in a casual remark that reveals a whole lot more than you might think at first glance.
So in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul just casually mentions that he hopes to preach in the regions beyond them. Now that phrase implies something very specific, that at the time he's writing, Corinth is the westernmost point he's ever been. And what do you know? When you trace his very first journey into Europe in the book of Acts, that's exactly the route you find. He travels west across Greece, and Corinth is the last stop, the end of the line before he turns around and sails back east. The casual remark fits the map perfectly.
So we've been looking at all these individual little clues. But the real force of this argument, the real power, comes when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, because a very clear, very powerful pattern starts to emerge.
Think about what we saw. Paul's deep despair gets explained by a riot we read about somewhere else. A vague command to forgive somebody gets totally clarified by a previous, very specific command. A messy travel schedule suddenly makes perfect sense. Two accounts seem to clash over his sufferings, only to line up perfectly on closer inspection. A passing comment about geography matches the historical map. The strength here isn't in any one of these things, but in the repeated, undesigned nature of the connections. And you know, what we've covered today is really just scratching the surface. In his book Horæ Paulinæ, William Paley lays out dozens and dozens of these subtle connections, not just for this letter, but across all of Paul's writings and the book of Acts. It creates this incredibly dense, interlocking web of evidence that becomes very, very hard to just brush off as coincidence or forgery.
Which really brings us to the final question we have to ask ourselves. If this incredibly complex tapestry of details is too subtle and too intricate to be the work of a forger, and it's far too consistent to be just a series of lucky accidents, then what does that imply about the reality of the letters themselves, the events they talk about, and the man who wrote them? That, I think, is something really worth thinking about.